We did talk about dogs. We talked about horses. We talked about mules. We talked about species and what makes up a species. What makes a species? How do we define a species? Okay, their looks is one way to do it. How else? What they can breed with? Their traits. Okay. So, we said that there was the really old-fashioned way, the way that humans first identified species, and that was based totally on appearances. Totally on how they look. Ooh, this thing has 4 legs, so does that thing. I think they're similar. Okay. Shape of skull, whatever. And then we got a little bit more sophisticated and we said, well, if these two things can breed and produce what kind of offspring? Fertile offspring. We'll call them a species. Fertile, yeah, fertile means they can have kids. Sterile or not fertile means they cannot. Fertile, they say fertile versus fertile. Yeah. And we use the word sterile, and you'll hear sterile versus sterile. Yeah. Potato, potato. Doesn't matter. Coupon, coupon. No, if you're non-fertile, you cannot have kids. That mule cannot have kids. And that's exactly where we're going to go. Thank you. You did a very nice lead-in there. So what we said is that the modern definition of species... Okay, so we said that the way we define species now, there is a component where it's morphology. It's what they look like. It's their appearances. But it's also the ability to produce fertile offspring. So fertile offspring are offspring that can have babies of their own. And we also look at some shared DNA. So within a species, they're going to look similar. They're going to produce fertile offspring, and they're going to share some amount of their DNA. And this here is a horse.
Did you add something?
I did.
Okay.
Oh, not since I put it on Classroom. Oh, this slide we already had. Yes, I did add to it. I'm sorry. So you're getting this one again with additions. This here is a horse. If you breed a horse and a horse, guess what you get? A horse. A horse, of course. But, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, this here is a donkey. Donkeys are awesome animals. They're neat. I know somebody who is obsessed with donkeys. She wants to run a donkey rescue farm and just rescue donkeys. I don't know. Everybody wants something different. Isn't it a good thing? This here's a horse. If we cross a horse and a donkey, we get a mule. So if we cross a mule and a mule, guess what we get? Nothing. They can't have babies. There are a variety of reasons. So when we get into, remind me of that question when we get into genetics and we have gamete day in biology. Gamete day is a whole bunch of fun. When we have gamete day, we'll talk about why hybrids usually cannot reproduce. No. And there are, as I was looking at pictures of mules, it turns out, yeah, if you want to breed mules, so you know how there are dog breeders? Like I had friends who used to breed golden retrievers. They had a really nice golden retriever, and they would breed her like once every 2 years and sell a batch of puppies, and it was great. If you were, I found a farm when I was looking for pictures of mules that they are a mule breeding farm. They sell mules. So, what kind of livestock does a mule breeding farm keep around? Horses and donkeys. They're not breeding mules to mules because, I mean, mules could breed all day if they wanted to. I don't know if they want to or not. I don't know if they even go into heat. But nothing's going to happen. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Were you wondering if they...
Yeah, I was wondering, didn't you say that they can't reproduce?
Right, the mules cannot reproduce. So, they could perform the act of mating, but there's not going to be offspring from it.
So what if it was like a mule and like a horse?
Well, there have been some weird isolated cases where mules were able to reproduce, but in general we say mules cannot reproduce. And that was, I think the one video
It's very rare.
it's, yeah, like, 1 in 10,000 mules might be capable of reproducing, but never with another mule, but possibly with a donkey or a horse. So, and it's a real random chance. And again, when we have gamete day, we'll talk about why that could happen. So, okay. So, when we take two species that are not, two animals that are not in the same species, or two organisms that aren't in the same species, if they're able to produce offspring, those offspring aren't fertile. And there are some places where we intentionally produce non-fertile offspring. Where do we get these non-fertile hybrids? So mules are the big one. You know the horse. Who here has ever stood next to a horse? Good. If not, I was going to give you homework. They're huge. They are some big animals. They demand a lot of respect because they will crush you. Mrs. Haylett actually had a horse roll over on her. Not good. They're big. And, you know, the kind of horses that people ride, quarter horses and Arabians and those horses, they're big, but they're not particularly strong. Donkeys are incredibly strong for their size. So they're little teeny tiny animals, but like pound for pound, they are powerful. I've known people like this, people who were like little teeny tiny people, but man, pound for pound, they were fierce. So when you breed a horse and a donkey, you get a mule, and here's the good thing about mules. They have horse size and donkey strength. So they're actually better than either of their parents in terms of what they're able to do. In a lot of images of people plowing, like if you watch any kind of drama set in the 1860s, I'm a sucker for period dramas. There's always somebody out in a field plowing the field with a horse-drawn implement, except very often it's not a horse. It's a mule, because that mule is big but also very, very powerful. When we say open zoos, places like Pymatuning Deer Park, where animals are mingling, they're not separated. Yeah. So in what we call an open zoo, where we have lions and tigers and they are hanging out together. They can occasionally mate, not in the wild. What would happen if a male tiger walked up to a female lion in the wild? He would be killed by the members of her pride. Like, no mating would happen. Someone would die. Possibly multiple people would die. Multiple animals would die. But in zoos, where they're outside of their natural social environment, they're not in a pride, they're not, it can happen. And you can produce a liger or a tiglon, whatever. Tigon. Yeah, whatever. And those have also been made to be a novelty animal, to be something that people kind of go, wow, that's weird. There have been zorses bred. What do you think a zorse is? Zebra horse. So, but again, they can't reproduce in kind. You can't start a species of zorses. So, the other place is there have been sometimes reasons for controlled breeding. Who in here fishes? Okay. Anybody ever seen a walleye? I squeezed lots of walleyes for egg and sperm one spring. Walleyes are a nice, big, meaty fish. People like walleyes, and they taste wonderful. There's another fish called a sauger. It is less well known. Has anybody seen a sauger? Okay. They're a game fish. They're described as being really feisty. And for people who like a really good fight in a fish, saugers are your candidate. Unfortunately, saugers are not real big. They're not real meaty. They're kind of a scrawny, they're kind of skinny. Well, the Ohio Division of Wildlife has crossed saugers and walleyes, and you get a saugai. Huh? Oh, did you find the link on the DNR? Yeah. And they show the two parental crosses, because you can't name them as one species, because they're actually the result of the crossing of two species. So remember how I said, stick a walleye's nose in your armpit, hold her tail, squeeze her belly, a bunch of eggs pour out. They're golden, they're beautiful, they're like bright yellow. Fill up a bucket full of eggs, and what we were doing, we were producing walleye, so you'd grab a male walleye, tickle his belly, he sperms into the bucket, stir it up, send it to the hatchery. Well, in the case of saugeyes, you squeeze all those female walleyes into the bucket, but then instead of taking a male walleye and applying his sperm to the bucket, you get a male sauger. Nose in the armpit, squeeze his belly, he's going to put sperm in the bucket, and then those offspring are going to be sawguys. So it's a cross. Would it happen in the wild? No, it wouldn't. We're going to talk about why. So, oops. Why don't you usually get hybrids in the wild? Well, species are typically isolated from one another in some way. What does it mean if you are isolated? I can't hear you, dear.
He said singled out.
Singled out. Okay, you're alone. Yeah. You're separated from everybody else. Well, species tend to be separated from one another in a couple different ways, which means that different species don't end up interbreeding. This is also how we start to see new species form, and this image is the Galapagos Islands, which is where Darwin did a lot of his work.
Is there any hybrids that can reproduce?
There are. When we get into, again, when we get to gamete day, and I hand you a gamete, we're going to talk about why some can and some can't, because it's actually a problem from an ecology perspective, and so we'll talk about it there, and we'll talk about it when we do gametes. Great question. Pardon? Can hybridize with a non-human species? Right, we're talking about species. So this is the equivalent of a human reproducing with a Neanderthal, if we had a living Neanderthal, because Neanderthals are a different species. All the humans on the planet alive today are Homo sapiens. Now, what our genome tells us is that at some point, humans did reproduce with Neanderthals, because we do have little bits of Neanderthal DNA. Okay, so this is the Galapagos Islands, and on these islands you find all these different species of birds that all seem to have a common ancestor. They're separated. How are those birds separated? By water. They're on islands. They can't, now some of the islands they could fly back and forth to, but some of these little islands are pretty far out, and these are little teeny tiny birds who don't fly very well. They're not going to make a voyage over an open ocean. So we have different kinds of isolation, and we're going to talk about those. Let's think about what isolation means. Do you remember doing the clipbirds? Okay. So when we started off clipbirds, we had one species, one population. Remember, a population is all the members of a single species who live in a single area and can reproduce together. And then something happened on the island. What happened? We had a volcanic eruption or something, and a big mountain chain grew up in the middle of the island. So now the birds on the west couldn't get to the birds on the east, and vice versa. They were isolated from one another. So now you have two populations. They can't interbreed anymore. And I don't remember if it was east or west where we had big toot fruit and tiny toot fruit. But on one end of the island, the food started to change on each end of the island. So the population started to shift in response to their environment. What do you think? So by the end of, 4 generations, I think we had all big bills on one side and all small bills on the other. What do you think that would look like in 500 years? Well, I think they'd be very different.
What if they can't mate with each other?
Well, no, because this is, remember, starting out, good question. Starting out, this was all one species. So on the west and on the east, it was all one species. All the birds on the west, after the mountains popped up, were still breeding with one another. So big bills and small bills and medium bills could still breed. But I think we'll say everybody but the big bills died out on the west. So it was all big bills. On the east, everybody but the little bills died out. So it was all little bills. So 4 generations out, we have the East and the West looking really different. After 500 years, do you think that they might look even more different than that? It's quite possible. Depends on what the environment there does. So after 500 years, we might actually have two different species that could not breed with one another. It's possible. So there are two major kinds of isolation, and the clipbirds is an example of the first kind. Geographic isolation. What does geographic mean? Okay, we think about maps, we think about locations, the whole world. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I can't think of what
Okay. Geo means earth. Geographic, we're typically talking about like maps. If you take like in 4th grade geography, you might have, learned all the states by their borders. Did you do that? They still do that? Okay.
I stopped teaching courses.
I know. So geographic isolation is when two populations aren't reproducing together because they can't get to one another. Sure, they'd love to mate. They can't get there. So the clipbirds were an example of geographic isolation. They couldn't get to the other side of the island to mate with other birds. So this here, and I have seen these squirrels live and in person. Do that. So these two squirrels look a lot alike, don't they? The weird thing about these squirrels is they have these tufts on their ears. Their ears have like extra hair coming off the end. They look almost like bunny ears. The tufts of hair are so long. And this is called an Abert's squirrel, which doesn't matter to you. When I lived in Arizona, where I lived, this was the only kind of squirrel that existed. It was the Abert's squirrel. And it took me most of a year to get over how funny looking they were because they had these stupid bunny ears, like a squirrel with bunny ears. It's just bizarre. And it's just extra hair sticking up off the top. They're called tufts. Well, that's an Abert's squirrel. This is a Kaibab squirrel. They look a lot alike. This, you know what that is? It's a big canyon. I've given you a hint by saying where I used to live. It's the Grand Canyon. Yeah, I lived in southern Arizona, but it's the Grand Canyon. It's a pretty darn big divide.
Did you ever walk on it?
I did not. I never went to the Grand Canyon when I lived in Arizona. So Kaibab squirrels only live north of the Grand Canyon, and Abert squirrels only live on the south side of the Grand Canyon.
At one point, they was together.
At one point, they were a single species, but they became isolated. They couldn't reproduce anymore. No squirrel is going to hike down into the canyon, cross the raging Colorado River, and hike up the other side to get a sweetheart. It's not going to happen. Proximity selection says squirrels are not going into long-distance relationships.
Isn't there a flying squirrel?
There is, but they don't truly fly, and they don't live here. They glide. Yeah, they glide.
I jumped past my farm driveway, and it was like,
And a flying squirrel would not make it across the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, I know.
Sugar glider.
Yes.
What made you come to Ohio?
At one time, these two species, they have a common ancestor. If we were looking at this on what kind of tree was that, where we looked at species and their relationships, so we could say the Kaibab squirrel and the Abert's squirrel. What was that? What was that called? A what?
It's something.
Phylogenetic tree? Yeah. If we looked at the Kaibab and the Abert squirrel on a phylogenetic tree, they'd be pretty closely related. But at some point, they were geographically isolated and they couldn't reproduce. So they started to form different species. Now, the other kind of isolation has got nothing to do with geography. It's reproductive isolation, and it is biological. So you get two populations that can't reproduce because there is some kind of biological roadblock. So we said, if a tiger walks into a group of lions, they're like, hey, I think you're pretty cute. You want to mate? He's going to get killed. That's a biological roadblock. That is a biological roadblock. Mating with this individual means you will die. That's a biological roadblock. Mating behavior. So you have, birds have some really interesting mating behaviors, like males will dance or, make a pretty bed for the female for her eggs. They'll do all kinds of crazy things. Male birds really are out to impress females. If you have a male bird doing something that a female bird doesn't recognize as mating behavior, she's not going to mate with him. It's a biological roadblock. If what you think is mating behavior, she thinks is prey behavior, and you do your little mating dance in front of her and she kills you, that's a biological roadblock. It can happen. Breeding season. So this graphic should look familiar to you. You drew something very much like it in your drawings. This is a wood frog. We have these in the woods here in Ohio. They're wonderful little frogs. This is a leopard frog. And if the two of them, you could breed these two and produce a hybrid in a lab. If you mixed wood frog eggs and leopard frog sperm, you could produce a hybrid. In the wild, though, wood frogs mate early and leopard frogs mate late. So when the female wood frogs are out depositing their eggs, the male leopard frogs are like busy with other things. I don't know what they do. Working on something. I don't know what they're doing. But their breeding is isolated based on time. There are other species for whom they can perform the act, they can join their eggs and sperm, but no embryo will form. Very often, because they have different numbers of chromosomes, they don't have the same genes. So there are lots of different ways that you can have reproductive isolation, but it basically means that there's a biological reason these two cannot reproduce. So when you have populations that end up isolated from one another, how do we form a new species from that? Because that was, if we go all the way back, we were saying, like, how long does it take to form a new species? Well, it depends. Do I keep saying it depends? I think I do. But basically, after some amount of time and some amount of isolation, if we have disruptive selection working on, variation that's in the species, we can end up with more than one species out of one initial species. So there are two schools of thought, and it used to actually be a controversy, believe it or not. Wow! It used to be kind of a controversy. Are you a gradualist, or do you believe in punctuated equilibrium? What does it mean if something happens gradually?
Takes time.
It's real slow. So your hair grows gradually. Does your hair look longer today to you than it did yesterday? No. But if you don't get your hair cut for 6 months and then you take a picture of today and a picture in 6 months, is your hair going to look different? Yeah. But the change was so slow you didn't even see it happening. Gradualism is the idea that we have this one species and there are little tiny subtle changes. And this one doesn't look that different from this one, and this one doesn't look that different from this one, and this one doesn't look that different from this one. But if you just suddenly go and compare this and this, whoa, they're really different. The change is very, very, very gradual, and you can't actually see it happening. It's so gradual that, but if you look at over long periods of time, like 100 years or 1,000 years, suddenly you realize, oh man, those are two different species. The other idea is this idea of punctuated equilibrium. So what is punctuation? Punctuation. Punctuation. It can mean when you puncture something, in an English sense, like periods, commas, exclamation points. What's equilibrium? Everything stays the same. In punctuated equilibrium, we're saying everything stays the same, stays the same, stays the same, then boom, it changes. Oh, Look at that. And then everything stays the same, stays the same, stays the same, and then boom, it changes. So that there are long periods where nothing is really changing, followed by pretty sudden changes. And like I said, it used to be a controversy, and biologists would argue about, if it worked this way or this way. What the evidence points to, and remember in science we like evidence, is that it actually happens both ways. It depends on the environment, it depends on the species. It happens both ways. Okay, that is it for this section. Here's the way this is going to work. Right now, you've got your vocabulary sheet, so a couple things are going to happen. The vocab sheet that you have been faithfully working on. I've been giving you little incremental grades all along. I gave you a grade for the first 2 columns. I gave you a grade for these 6 words, these 9 words. I'm going to give you a grade for the whole thing overall again. So I'll give you a grade for like the last few words we have to fill in, and then for the whole thing. So if you have missed words in the first 2 columns, this is the time to get them done. If you have words that were not correct, that second column has to be an exact dictionary definition. It is not your rephrasing of the dictionary. It is an exact dictionary definition of that word, or glossary definition if you're using the textbook. So, for the rest of today, what you have time to do is touch up anything you need to on that vocab sheet. Finish the 3rd column. At this point, I think we've gotten all the words in the 3rd column. If there are any that you feel like we have not discussed, let me know. So, first column is going to be all like pieces that you've connected. Like, oh, I know what equal means. Oh, wait, disrupt. I know what that means. I disrupt things all the time. It means to shake things up. That first column is, and the first column can include pictures or whatever. The second column is a dictionary definition. The 3rd column combines those first 2 and our notes to come up with a definition in your own words. Okay? So you got today to work on that. I'm going to check those tomorrow. There shouldn't be a whole lot of work on that because most of you are pretty well done with it. You're just doing that 3rd column on things, if you've been keeping up with it. Tomorrow when you come in, you're going to get a study guide. You're going to have the period to work on that study guide. Monday when you come in, now here's the hitch that I have. Okay, so my hitch is, my plan was to give this test Tuesday. Well, what's happening Tuesday, 7th period, as far as we know? Dodgeball, volleyball, whatever kind of, something with spherical objects in the gym. So my hope was that we would have Monday to do a review. I think what I'm going to do is this for you guys, because I don't know what's going to happen Tuesday, but I suspect I do. I'm going to release the answer key. So I'll check your study guide at the end of class on tomorrow, on Friday. I will release the answer key Friday night, so you'll have the answer key. You do your little video study guide from the answer key, whatever. You'll have to have that shared with me by Monday morning. And your test will be Monday,
If we share it
7th period.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can share it Monday morning. That's fine. You're basically your study guide, your video study guide will just have to be shared with me or sent to me or whatever before you walk in here. And then your test will be Monday. Maybe I'll make them both Monday. That might make more sense. Okay. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? 9. Okay. Wunderbar. And it was brought to my attention, I did forget a word. So when we end up with multiple species out of one species, that is the process of speciation. So speciation is basically, we'll say we'll say making. Making a new species. So, when things have disruptive selection working within one species in different areas, and you end up with very, very different populations. If those populations are isolated and they can't mix their DNA anymore, you can end up with organisms that are so different they're no longer able to interbreed, and then we have achieved speciation. They have made a new species. Okay.